Hello and welcome to another episode of Project Freedom United. I'm Gene Peachy, your host, and today we were with a gentleman by the name of Thomas Masty, who has quite a career to reflect on, and he's going to be talking about his days with Ronald Reagan and other people like Bob Dole and different politicians that have come in his path. Just to start, Thomas, are you there?
Yes, I am, Gene.
Hello, Tom. You mind
Hello.
if I read a little bit of your background?
No, go ahead.
Well, it says here, well, you're an old guy. You have a master's in arts and teaching at Wayne State University and certified master trainer and teacher at Longvin Learning System. And you grew up in Birmingham, Michigan. You were born in 1957. The same president that was born the same day was Howard Taft. That's quite a day to be born on. You earned a BA degree in political economy and politics, economics, and history at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. And some of the jobs you've had, this is quite impressive. The Oakland Press Advertising Sales Department, and you wrote feature articles. National Journalism Center in Washington, D.C. internship with Stan Evans program. You did an externship at the Human Events magazine, Committee for a Free Afghanistan Communications Director, and this is very impressive, you helped bring 7 Afghans to meet with Ronald Reagan in the White House and got Reagan to honor the freedom fighters by declaring a special day for the Mujahideen. And you hosted the congressional receptions, and
yes.
you served pork to the Muslims. Oops. Very interesting. And you also were on the Republican National Committee, the Director of Radio Services. You created a secret radio news network that delivered about 1 million votes for Ronald Reagan in 1984. That's something. That's quite a feat. 1 million votes. Tom, where would you like to begin?
Well, I've been thinking and preparing for this and taking time to reflect and think things over in my life, because I've entered hospice about 2 months ago, and I'm at stage 4 esophageal cancer, which causes me to change my perspective and to take stock of what's happened in my life, that to focus on what's truly important, and not the trivia that you only realize late in life was a waste of time. I lived a good life. I had interesting jobs. I met great people. Plenty of time to screw things up as I navigated Washington. We're in a tough patch, though, this country. I love this country dearly. And we're divided. We're superstitious of others. And we're better than that. We're tied to each other, whether we want to be or not. So it's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate it, Gene. And we'd like to mention there's one small upside to dying, and that's nobody interrupts you when you're trying to talk. So I'll make my most of this situation. Thank you.
And I think you had told me once a story about Ronald Reagan speaking Spanish. Can you share that with us?
Well, I kind of should explain what the network was, which explains why Reagan wanted to be on it. And what it was is that Frank Fahrenkopf was chairman of the Republican National Committee when I got the job as director of radio services. And my boss really didn't like the attention. And she said, I want you to go do what you want to do. Don't say anything to me. I don't want to hear from you. And I thought, this is really bad news. My brother said, no, it's not. She just gave you permission to do whatever you want. So I went ahead and was running radio actualities, which is the actual voice of a newsmaker, and sending it out to radio stations in Spanish and English. As I started doing that, I realized I could take the wire service and look at what the news stories were, call and get stories that were objective but used Reagan sources rather than the anti-Reagan sources that CBS and NBC were using. And so Reagan learned about this from Frank Fahrenkopf and said that he wanted to do it. So they sent me over to the White House, and I got to be in the little room off of the Oval Office. And the situation was that Reagan came in, he took out those little strips of paper he used to write things on, and began speaking in Spanish. I said, "Mr. President, I didn't know you spoke Spanish." He said, "Well, I had to. I was the governor of California." I said, "That's cool." And we went ahead and recorded it. And I went back to the RNC, to my office, and started to make tapes so we can send it over phone lines to the radio stations, 450 radio stations by then. My translator came by and he said, "Tom, what's that?" I said, "It's President Reagan giving a talk in Spanish." He said, "No, it's not." I said, "Yes, it is." He says, "No, it's not." I said, I've recorded it personally. I know it's Reagan." He said, "It might be Reagan, but it's not Spanish." And I got this immediate idea. I flicked on the microphone and I said, "This morning, President Ronald Reagan gave a Christmas greeting to the Hispanics of America and delivered the speech in Spanish." And then I cut the tape so it says, "Hola," and I lowered the volume so you could hear a rumble of him saying something, but couldn't tell what it was. I said, "Today the president said blah, blah, blah." And we ended up cutting the very end. You hear, bring his volume up at the end, and he says, "Feliz Navidad." Well, it became so popular, everybody in the Hispanic community was talking about how Reagan spoke Spanish. Years later, I've come to the conclusion it's either a Mexican dialect from the groundskeepers he learned, but some of the biographies say that he spoke Spanish, but only haltingly, and his aides kept telling him that it wasn't fluent enough. But he tried to do it, and we ended up saving the day. It was kind of fun.
You saved the President of the United States from an embarrassing moment that is historical, and not to mention hysterical. So I think that's pretty good. You know, is it true that you had a radio show, and were you supposed to interview Ted Kennedy or Bob Dole?
Working at the time for the RNC, and the PR company called and said, "How would you like to earn some money off the clock? And we'll hire you to write a minute speech a day for Bob Dole." And that by doing this, he's going to debate Ted Kennedy every day on airlines, and we're going to supply the tapes to the airlines. I said, "This is great." So we went through the first 5 or so minutes of audio, and they were easy to get along with. Then they called up and said, "We want you to write a next speech, minute speech on abortion, but make it funny because Bob's a funny guy." There's nothing funny about abortion in my book. So I turned around and I went back to work, and they called me up and they said, I thought, I really don't want this job. And they said, "Is there anything you'd like to see Bob Dole debate Ted Kennedy about?" I said, "How about drunk driving?" So without thinking, they got Ted Kennedy on the phone, and they said, "Senator, how would you like to debate Bob Dole on drunk driving?" And he said, "What am I going to be, in favor of it?" And he slammed the phone down, and he stormed onto the Senate floor and said, Bob, do you know what those expletives in your office did now?"
So what happened?
Well, they called me back and they said, "We're calling you about the radio, this deal with Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy." I said, "I'm fired, aren't I?" They said, "Yes." I said, "But you're calling me." And they said, "Well, yes." I said, "That means you want 3 more minutes of radio so you can bring somebody else on." And they said, "Yes." And that's how it ended.
Very, very interesting. That's quite a story to tell. I don't imagine that story is published anywhere. That's a
No.
first here, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't think
Yes,
so.
it
Well, what else would you like to add on your experiences in Washington, D.C.?
Oh heavens, I made a list of Washington stories, and I came to about 96 stories. So if you can be a bit more specific, is there something at the RNC, or is there something at Right to Work, or
Well, I'm
something
looking at the list here, and it's quite impressive. What did you do with Nancy Reagan?
Well, Nancy was kind of interesting. I was working at the time for the California State Senate, and Nancy Reagan was, of course, pushing the say no to drugs. And we were trying to get legislation through to give some money to the sheriff's office because they were being asked to pick up the anti-drug efforts on state parks and federal lands, but they weren't getting any money to do it. And so the sheriff said, "Can you help us out?" And so I went to Washington, talked to everybody, and we got money in the budget allocated for this cause. And we wrote 3 bills to give $1 million each to 3 different sheriff's offices in order to get them get out the anti-drug message for Nancy Reagan. Well, as we did that, I found out a week later that they had taken the money out of the budget. Some guy who was pro-drug had just blue-lined it out, and he lied to David Stockman. Kept telling Dave Stockman that the money was in the budget, but it wasn't. And so I had to keep going back. And finally, the chief of staff for Senator H.L. Richardson got to Nancy Reagan, and she called Stockman on a Sunday night and chewed him out, and the money reappeared in the budget the next day.
Did that backfire on you?
No,
You know,
they said that it was a little bit prickly to deal with on this, but I was certainly in the right.
I'm looking at the notes here, and it says you dealt with the Secret Service a lot. Something to do with taking a bullet for Marge Heckler.
Oh yeah, I'm working with Maureen Reagan. I'm talking to Secret Service as we're waiting, and I said, "How do you get into the headset that you're willing to take a bullet for Marge Heckler, who was Secretary of Interior, maybe?" And so the Secret Service looked at me kind of scared and said, "We try not to talk about it or think about it." I also had a time with Maureen Reagan.
Yeah.
That we went into a little country bar, and Maureen Reagan came in and sat down, and she says to the waitress, she wants a hamburger and a cup of coffee. Well, the waitress comes over and says, You're not going to have to use any sugar in that coffee because my thumb slipped into the cup." Maureen Reagan kind of recoiled, and she started to prepare, and she said, "Can I get silverware?" And the waitress said, "What are you going to do? Cut your French fries?" Maureen Reagan, her eyes sort of crossed. She didn't know what to say. It was really pretty funny. Secret Service was dying in the booth in the corner.
Now, what's this about Secret Service blowing up Reagan's birthday gift from Nancy? What did they do to it?
Oh, well, a package arrived at the White House, and it was, or the Reagan Ranch. I'm not sure which area at this moment, but it was for the president. And the guy who was the agent took it in and fluoroscoped it and saw 2 wires to a battery. And he thought, this really doesn't look good. So he thought it was a bomb, and he took it out back and put a quarter stick of dynamite under it and blew it up. Problem was, it was a glass elephant that turned on a glass vase that was being sent to Ron Reagan by his wife. So Reagan calls and gets the guy on the phone and says, "Is this Agent Smith?" He says, "Yes, Mr. President." He said, "Are you the man that blew up my birthday present?" He said, "I thought he was going to start to cry." And I said, "Yes, Mr. President." And at that point, Reagan said, "Well, stay away from Nancy. She's just kind of hot for a few weeks."
Blew up an elephant from Nancy Reagan to Ronald Reagan. Very good. Secret Service is right on cue there, aren't they? And then, oh, did they blow up something else too? Something from George Shultz? They blew up another president?
Oh, well, George Shultz got a package at his office before he was Secretary of State, and he was under Secret Service protection. And they looked at it, and it was just a big box, and it sat in front of the guard's office for the whole morning. He thought, this isn't safe. We don't know what's in the box. So he put a bomb blanket over it. Well, bomb blankets weigh about 50 pounds. And when he got done, the package wasn't 2 feet tall. It was about 3 inches tall. And so they opened it up and found it was a Ming vase as a gift from China to the new Secretary of State.
What is the most outstanding story you would like to talk about in regards to President Reagan?
Well, I think Reagan's, the most interesting was that when we brought the Afghans to meet the president, we said, where do you want to go? And in their language, they said, we want to go to the Lincoln Memorial. And so we took them over, and on the way, this guy who had been on the Supreme Court in Afghanistan before the war with the Soviets was wearing a white robe or garment with a black turban with gold fringe. And he stood up and he recited something. And we said, what is that? And the guy started repeating it. And it was the Gettysburg Address. And he recited it first in Dari and then in Pushtu. He had memorized it. And so we said, that's pretty amazing. And he says, I can't go to see the monument. I have no gift for Mr. President. We said, well, why don't you pray for him? Because he would appreciate that, and just pray the way you know how to pray. And he said, okay. So he goes up the steps and he sees these children looking at the marble statue of Lincoln. And he says, great man you worship, great man you worship. And the parents say, who's the guy with the turban kissing my kids? I said, well, he was on the Supreme Court before the war. He's meeting with the President of the United States tomorrow. They said, can we meet him? I said, he's kissing your kids. So I guess so. We went over and started to talk to him. And the people said, he said, my children would be much like yours if they were here today. They said, where are your children? He said, well, last April I was on my way home from the court, and I saw the Soviet officers recognized me, and he raised his Kalashnikov and shot me in the legs, and I fell. And when I did, he stood up and saw his wife and children run out of the house to help him. And he saw the Soviet raise the gun and machine gun his wife and children before his very eyes. And he said, but this is a great man you worship, the greatest man in the history of liberty. And they said, we don't understand. I mean, it's Lincoln. He said, well, Lincoln is the greatest because he defended freedom for people who weren't from his own tribe. And with that, he taught me more about what it meant to be an American in an afternoon than years of school. And what I find interesting is Reagan heard the story and liked it so much he told it at least 5 times in various talks.
Something that is in today's headlines and has gone full circle from the day you were working with the President Reagan has come full circle. And if I bring it up, I think it'll bring back some stories from you and how it relates to today. What can you talk about in regards to Star Wars and the Golden Dome?
Oh, that's interesting. When I was at the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, Daniel O. Graham was on the board. And he came over one day and I got a chance to talk to him. And General Graham said that he was pushing a new project called Project High Frontier. And he got out some brochures and showed me how it would work, which is basically Star Wars is what they called it later. And they worked very well, actually. They tested it numerous times. It made all the successful testing, but they ran out of money, so the project got cut. And today, where Golden Dome is basically the same thing as Project High Frontier with a little more current technology. And it was General Graham and the high frontier guys that got it all started back in the 80s.
Was it Star Wars that led to the fall of the Soviet Empire?
Well, it's a claim that's made. Personally, I think that it was Ronald Reagan, Mark Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II that led to the fall of the Soviet Empire. Is much stronger argument.
I'd always thought that maybe they gave in because we made more weapons that they couldn't counteract and couldn't keep up with it. That was the only story I always heard.
Well, actually, at Reykjavik, Reagan went and it's an interesting story because it starts in 1963. Reagan was just done negotiating with Jack Warner. He came out to hold a press conference with reporters, and one said, if you were in President Kennedy's shoes and asked to negotiate with Khrushchev, but the terms of the treaty aren't in the favor of the United States, but would get rid of nuclear bombs, what would you do? And Reagan looked at him, he said, I'm an actor, why would you ask me that? I said, well, it's a theoretical question. I said, I'll give you a theoretical answer. I'd walk across the room, I'd put my hand on his shoulder, I'd bend down and I'd whisper one word and I'd leave. So what's the word? He said, niet. Now you've seen what happened 40 years later in the film Reagan, where he goes ahead and sits down in Reykjavik and Gorbachev asked to have him destroy like 17 categories of weapons. And Reagan said, sure. Secret Service went nuts. They thought that the State Department thought Reagan had lost it, and they were ready to throttle him. They didn't know what to do. Turns out that he finally, after all this, Gorbachev said, well, of course, if you don't get rid of Star Wars, it means nothing. Reagan got up and walked around the table. He put his hand on the shoulder of Gorbachev, leaned down and whispered, niet, and walked. And Gorbachev ran out in the snow, screaming, Mr. President, come back to the talk.
What happened with the Taliban seizing power and an error the CIA made?
Yeah, well, what happened was the Taliban, we were pushing to get Stinger missiles for the Afghan Mujahideen.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were pushing for that, to be honest. We weren't the only ones. And we had, when the Afghans met with Reagan, they made it their claim that they wanted to have needed to have these missiles. And so Reagan authorized it and said, go ahead and give these guys missiles. Well, the CIA, instead of giving them to the Mujahideen, they gave them to ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, which is notoriously unreliable. And they gave it to the Taliban, which then took Kabul with them. So it was the CIA goof that put the Taliban in power.
Whoa. CIA, once again. Good for them, aren't they just...
Friends.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm looking more at this. I mean, the list is Charlie Wilson's War. What was that about?
Charlie Wilson's War. He wanted to. He took a lot of claim. They made a movie out of it. How this was his war, and he personally commandeered everything and got Reagan to give Stinger missiles, and it was a lot of bold claims. But the thing that's funny about it is he had these pictures that he went to Afghanistan and he was in a firefight with the Soviets. Well, I talked to a couple of the Afghans that led him on that firefight. They said, we didn't want a U.S. congressman getting in the way of a shooting match and then having it hit the media. So we drove him around for about 3.5 hours back and forth across the border of Pakistan. And we then told him, well, he was still in Pakistan, told him, you're in Afghanistan now. And here's a Soviet tank. And the boys got up and attacked the Soviet tank with with their weapons and shouted and yelled. And Charlie Wilson was happy and got his picture taken with the Mujahideen. And that's about it. It was it's a lot of PR bluff.
No doubt he wrote a book. Or not. And, well, you must have been, were you a fly on the wall for Grenada?
Grenada was interesting. I ended up, I was working at the Republican National Committee doing those radio shows for 450 radio stations. One morning I went to the wire and ripped it off, and it looked and it said that we were invading Grenada to bring back these medical students. And so I thought, I can't call it an invasion. And I went to my brother, who was the chief speechwriter for the Republican Party at the time, and said, how would you handle this? He said, I'd call it a liberation, which I thought was great. So I put it in my news. Well, the White House got a copy of my news every day at that point. And Reagan then started calling it a liberation instead of an occupation or invasion. And so that's part of the story. The other part is we had, at the time I was with Committee for a Free Afghanistan, we had rallies and things like this in Lafayette Park. And it was pretty fun. I can get into more detail, but that's the gist of it.
You know, if we're probably going to be wrapping this up pretty soon, and maybe we should do it in this area, something to do with Ronald Reagan showing his spiritual side with you and outside the Oval Office. What was that about?
Well, one of the times I recorded the president, when he left, I said the same thing I always said, whether I was at a press conference or in the White House Oval Office, not in the Oval Office, next to it. And as he went by, I whispered, God bless you, Mr. President. And I just as soft as I could. He turned around and came back in the room, spun on his heel and looked at me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've just offended the President of the United States. The guy's got nuclear weapons. Life is over. I was 24 years old, and I could feel the sweat pouring out of my neck and my forehead. My palms were drenched. And he said, thank you. Presidents need that more than you know, and went into the Oval Office. I found out later that he did the same response with LaGree Daniels. He got back on the podium and gave her a kiss on the forehead for saying, God bless you, Mr. President. But what's astounding is that day that he said that to me, he came out and the White House press corps was there, and Sam Donaldson was shouting, Mr. President, what about whatever the issue was? And Reagan looked at him and said, huh? He could hear me whisper from 30 feet, but he couldn't hear Sam Donaldson from 5 feet. So I think he had selective hearing.
Yeah, frequencies. Thomas, this has been a fascinating moment for people to hear your stories and to share your experiences with one of the greatest presidents the United States has ever had, which I think is now being waned by President Donald Trump. And
I think they work as bookends.
They certainly do. And I just sort of think there's one spirit steps inside the other spirit. It seems that way, but he's come at the right time, I do hope. And on that note, I'm going to say, and everyone here with us is going to say a small prayer for you and hopeful maybe a recovery for you in regards to your bout with this cancer.
Thank you, but also for our nation needs it right now.
Yes, it does. And I think that's about all we have for Project Freedom United. And we'll do another episode soon. How about we plan for that, Thomas?
Nice. I'd like that, Gene.
We've been with Thomas Masty, giving us a little insight of his life in the past in Washington, D.C. with President Reagan. Thank you, and see you again. You're welcome, Thomas. See you again soon. Bye.